a deep investigation into the man behind one of history's most devastating religious predictions. Who was Frederick Franz, the man who, without ever declaring himself a prophet, led millions to believe that the end of the world would come in 1975? This question pierces through one of the most compelling yet tragic stories in modern religious history. Picture this: a self-taught scholar of biblical languages, revered as a spiritual genius by his followers, yet remembered by history as the architect of one of the 20th century's greatest religious disappointments. Frederick William Franz was not just another religious leader. He was the intellectual powerhouse behind the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the organization that governs Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. While most religious figures claim divine inspiration through emotional revelations or mystical experiences, Franz built his authority on something seemingly more solid: scholarly interpretation of ancient texts, mathematical calculations, and chronological precision. But here lies the central mystery we'll investigate. How did a man who never officially claimed to be a prophet convince millions that he had calculated the exact timing of God's final judgment? How did his personal interpretations become unquestionable doctrine for an entire religious movement? And most disturbing of all, when his calculations proved catastrophically wrong, how did he manage to maintain his position of absolute authority until his death? In this investigation, we'll uncover the life, the power, and the devastating legacy of Frederick Franz. We'll examine how his interpretation didn't just shape doctrine, it shaped destinies. We'll explore how families sold their homes, young people abandoned their educations, and entire communities restructured their lives around a date that would live in infamy: 1975. This is not just the story of a failed prediction. This is the story of how one brilliant mind wielded unprecedented influence over millions of lives, and how the consequences of that influence ripple through generations to this day. Chapter 1: Origins and Formation, the Making of a Prophet. Frederick William Franz was born on September 12, 1893, in Covington, Kentucky, into a world vastly different from the religious empire he would eventually help construct. The United States was experiencing rapid industrialization, and traditional religious beliefs were being challenged by new scientific discoveries and social changes. It was in this context of religious uncertainty that young Frederick would develop the intellectual tools that would later make him one of the most influential religious figures of the 20th century. Franz's early life showed signs of the intellectual prowess that would later captivate millions. Unlike many religious leaders who claim divine calling through emotional experiences, Franz's path to power was paved with academic achievement and scholarly pursuits. He demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for languages from an early age, a talent that would become the cornerstone of his religious authority. In 1911, Franz enrolled at the University of Cincinnati to study theology, a decision that would prove pivotal not just for his personal development, but for the future of millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. At the university, he immersed himself in the study of biblical languages: Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. These weren't casual studies. Franz approached ancient languages with the intensity of a scholar preparing for a lifetime of textual analysis. During his university years, Franz developed what would become his signature approach to biblical interpretation, a combination of linguistic analysis, mathematical calculation, and chronological precision. His professors noted his exceptional ability to grasp complex grammatical structures and his almost obsessive attention to numerical details in ancient texts. However, Franz's university career would be cut short by an encounter that would change not just his life, but the lives of millions. In 1913, during his junior year, Franz encountered the publications of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, then led by Charles Taze Russell. These publications, particularly Studies in the Scriptures, presented a systematic approach to biblical prophecy that fascinated the young theology student. Franz's conversion to what would later become known as Jehovah's Witnesses was not an emotional experience but an intellectual one. He was drawn to Russell's mathematical approach to biblical prophecy, his detailed chronological calculations, and his systematic interpretation of prophetic texts. For a young man already fascinated by the technical aspects of biblical study, Russell's approach seemed to offer a scientific method for understanding divine truth. In 1914, making one of the most significant decisions of his life, Franz abandoned his university studies just 1 year before graduation. This decision would later be portrayed by the Watchtower organization as evidence of his spiritual dedication, but it also reveals something crucial about Franz's character. He was willing to abandon conventional academic credentials in favor of what he believed was a higher form of truth. Franz arrived at the Watchtower headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, in 1920, at the age of 27. The organization was in transition following the death of founder Charles Taze Russell in 1916 and the controversial leadership of Judge Joseph Franklin Rutherford. Franz entered this environment as a young man with impressive linguistic skills but no formal religious authority. However, Franz's abilities quickly set him apart. His knowledge of biblical languages was superior to most others in the organization, and his systematic approach to textual analysis impressed the leadership. More importantly, Franz possessed something rare in religious organizations: the ability to present complex theological concepts in ways that seemed both scholarly and accessible. During these early years, Franz began developing the interpretive methods that would later make him the most powerful theological voice in the organization. He combined his linguistic knowledge with an increasingly complex system of prophetic interpretation that relied heavily on numerical calculations and chronological analysis. Franz's authority within the organization was built on a foundation that seemed unshakable: his claimed expertise in biblical languages. While other leaders relied on charisma or organizational skills, Franz positioned himself as the scholarly voice that could unlock the true meaning of ancient texts. This positioning was brilliant in its effectiveness. Who could argue with someone who claimed to understand the original languages of the Bible? Franz understood that in a religious organization, the person who can interpret the sacred texts holds ultimate power. While others might lead administratively, the interpreter of Scripture leads spiritually. And spiritual leadership, in a religious organization, is the highest form of power. By the late 1920s, Franz had established himself as the primary theological voice within the organization. His writings began appearing regularly in Watchtower publications, and his interpretations began shaping the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. More significantly, Franz began developing the complex chronological system that would later lead to the 1975 prediction. The 1930s and 1940s marked Frederick Franz's transformation from a talented young scholar to the most influential theological voice in the Watchtower organization. This wasn't an accidental rise to power. It was the result of Franz's strategic positioning of himself as indispensable to the organization's mission and identity. During the 1930s, under the leadership of Judge Rutherford, the organization was undergoing dramatic changes. The name Jehovah's Witnesses was adopted in 1931, and the group was distancing itself from many of the teachings of founder Charles Taze Russell. In this environment of doctrinal change, Franz positioned himself as the scholar who could provide theological justification for new directions while maintaining the appearance of biblical authority. Franz's role as primary translator and writer for Watchtower publications gave him unprecedented influence over the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses. Every major doctrinal article, every prophetic interpretation, every significant theological position had to pass through Franz's intellectual filter. He wasn't just interpreting Scripture. He was creating the lens through which millions of people would view reality itself. In 1942, following Judge Rutherford's death, Nathan Knorr became the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. However, those who understood the organization's power structure knew that while Knorr held the administrative title, Franz held the real power, the power of doctrinal interpretation. This arrangement was perfect for Franz. He had all the authority of religious leadership without the administrative burdens and public accountability that came with the presidency. Knorr handled organizational matters, public representation, and administrative decisions, while Franz controlled what really mattered in a religious organization: what people believed. Franz's appointment as vice president in 1945 formalized a power structure that had already existed in practice. The title was almost irrelevant. Franz's real authority came from his position as the organization's primary theological interpreter. When Franz spoke or wrote about biblical matters, his words carried the weight of divine authority for millions of believers. Franz's genius lay not just in his interpretive abilities, but in how he structured those interpretations to seem unquestionable. He developed a complex system of biblical cross-referencing, chronological calculations, and prophetic interpretation that appeared scholarly and systematic. The average Jehovah's Witness couldn't hope to understand, much less challenge, the intricate web of reasoning that Franz constructed. Consider Franz's approach to biblical chronology, which would later produce the 1975 prediction. Franz didn't simply claim divine revelation. He presented detailed calculations based on biblical genealogies, historical dates, and complex interpretive rules. The system was so intricate that only someone with Franz's claimed linguistic and historical knowledge could hope to verify or challenge it. This approach was psychologically brilliant. Franz's interpretations carried the authority of scholarship without the accountability of actual academic peer review. Members of the organization were encouraged to study Franz's reasoning, but only to understand and accept it, never to question or challenge it. The complexity of his system made dissent seem not just rebellious, but ignorant. During the 1940s and 1950s, Franz oversaw what amounted to a doctrinal revolution within the organization. Major teachings about the nature of Christ, the timing of Christ's presence, the identity of the faithful and discreet slave, and the chronology of biblical history were all subjects of Franz's reinterpretation. Each of these doctrinal changes followed the same pattern. Franz would present a complex biblical analysis that seemed to make the new interpretation inevitable. The changes were presented not as opinions or preferences, but as the natural result of better understanding of biblical truth. Franz's authority made these interpretations seem like discoveries rather than inventions. Franz's rise to power was protected by the organizational structure of the Watchtower. The organization's governing structure concentrated interpretive authority in a small group of men in Brooklyn, with Franz as the primary theological voice. This structure meant that challenging Franz's interpretations wasn't just disagreeing with an individual. It was challenging the organization's claim to divine guidance. As Franz's authority grew, so did his isolation from normal human feedback and accountability. Surrounded by subordinates who viewed his every interpretation as divinely guided, Franz lost touch with the practical consequences of his theological pronouncements. He became increasingly absorbed in complex prophetic calculations while remaining insulated from the real-world impact of those calculations on ordinary believers. By the 1960s, Franz had achieved something unprecedented in modern religious history: absolute theological authority over millions of people without any meaningful accountability for the consequences of his interpretations. He could reshape fundamental beliefs, redirect the life choices of entire communities, and redefine the hopes and fears of millions, all while being protected from serious critique or challenge. The 1975 prediction didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of Frederick Franz's decades-long obsession with biblical chronology. Franz had spent years developing what he believed was a precise chronological system that could date biblical events with mathematical accuracy. This system would become the foundation for one of the most specific prophetic predictions in modern religious history. Franz's chronological system was built on several key assumptions. First, he believed that the Bible contained enough chronological information to construct an accurate timeline from the creation of Adam to the present day. Second, he believed that significant biblical events occurred in patterns that could reveal God's prophetic timetable. Third, and most significantly, he believed that human history was organized in thousand-year periods that corresponded to God's creative days. The centerpiece of Franz's system was his calculation that exactly 6,000 years had passed from Adam's creation to 1975. This wasn't a casual estimate. Franz presented detailed calculations based on biblical genealogies, the dating of historical events, and complex interpretive rules for understanding biblical chronology. The precision of his calculations gave them an aura of scientific accuracy that impressed millions of believers. Franz's chronological calculations were embedded in a larger theological framework that made the 1975 date seem not just interesting, but prophetically significant. According to Franz's interpretation, each of God's creative days represented a 1,000-year period in human history. Since God rested on the seventh day after creation, the 7,000-year period of human history would be marked by God's rest, specifically, Christ's millennial reign. This framework transformed Franz's chronological calculation from an academic exercise into a prophetic revelation. If 6,000 years of human history ended in 1975, then the seventh millennium, the time of God's rest and Christ's reign, would begin immediately afterward. Franz wasn't just calculating dates, he was revealing God's prophetic timetable for human history. The 1975 prediction was formally introduced to Jehovah's Witnesses through the 1966 publication, Life, Everlasting and Freedom of the Sons of God. This book, written under Franz's direction, presented the chronological calculations and theological framework that pointed to 1975 as the end of 6,000 years of human history. The book's approach was strategically brilliant. Rather than making a direct prophetic claim, it presented the 1975 date as the result of careful biblical and historical research. The authors claimed to be simply following where the evidence led, rather than making prophetic pronouncements. This approach gave the prediction academic credibility while providing protection against accusations of false prophecy. What happened next reveals the power of Franz's authority within the organization. Despite the book's carefully qualified language, Franz's subsequent talks and writings increasingly treated the 1975 date as established fact rather than speculative calculation. In conventions, publications, and private conversations, the possibility that 1975 might mark the end became the expectation that 1975 would mark the end. Franz's role in this escalation was crucial. His talks at district conventions throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s increasingly emphasized the significance of 1975. He spoke with the authority of the organization's primary biblical scholar, and his apparent confidence in the chronological system convinced millions of believers that the end was truly imminent. The transformation of Franz's chronological speculation into prophetic certainty reveals important psychological dynamics at work within the organization. Franz's absolute authority as biblical interpreter meant that his level of confidence in an interpretation became the standard for how believers should view that interpretation. Franz didn't seem to understand the psychological impact of his authoritative presentation. When the organization's primary biblical scholar expressed confidence in a chronological calculation, millions of believers interpreted that confidence as virtual certainty. Franz's scholarly authority transformed his personal conviction into organizational doctrine. By the early 1970s, the 1975 prediction had developed institutional momentum that even Franz couldn't control. Circuit overseers were giving talks about 1975, district conventions were organized around themes related to the approaching end, and Watchtower publications regularly referenced the significance of the date. By 1975, Franz had staked his entire reputation and authority on his chronological system. He wasn't just the organization's biblical scholar. He was the man who had calculated the timing of the end. His scholarly authority and his prophetic reputation had become inseparable. As 1975 approached, the anticipation among Jehovah's Witnesses reached fever pitch. Frederick Franz's chronological calculations had created something unprecedented in modern religious history. Millions of believers organizing their entire lives around a specific date when they expected the current world system to end and God's kingdom to begin. The practical consequences of this anticipation were staggering. Across the globe, Jehovah's Witnesses were making life-altering decisions based on their faith in Franz's calculations. Young people postponed education, believing that the current world system would end before they could complete their studies. Couples delayed having children, thinking it would be cruel to bring children into a world about to be destroyed. Families sold homes, cashed in retirement funds, and abandoned career plans. The human cost of Franz's prediction becomes clear when we examine the personal testimonies of those who lived through this period. Thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses later described the dramatic life changes they made based on their faith in the 1975 prediction. Educational sacrifices were common. High school students turned down college scholarships, believing that higher education was unnecessary for people who would soon live in a paradise earth. Young adults abandoned professional training programs, thinking that their current jobs would be irrelevant after Armageddon. Financial decisions were equally dramatic. Families liquidated investments, believing that money would be worthless after the end of the current world system. Some sold houses and moved into rental properties, thinking they wouldn't need permanent housing much longer. Retirement planning was abandoned as unnecessary for people who expected to live forever in a paradise earth. The 1975 prediction wasn't confined to American Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a global phenomenon that affected every country where the organization was established. Franz's chronological system was presented as universal truth, applicable to all cultures and nations. The international scope of the prediction multiplied its impact and made its eventual failure even more devastating. Throughout this period, Frederick Franz maintained absolute confidence in his chronological system. His talks at district conventions during the early 1970s showed no hint of doubt about the significance of 1975. If anything, Franz seemed to grow more confident as the date approached, interpreting the enthusiasm of believers as confirmation that God was preparing his people for the end. As 1975 progressed, the tension within the organization became palpable. Every month that passed without Armageddon required explanation. Convention talks began emphasizing that the end could come at any time during 1975, not necessarily at the beginning of the year. Publications suggested that the end might come in the fall, coinciding with the Jewish calendar and the anniversary of Adam's creation. December 31, 1975, arrived like any other New Year's Eve, with celebrations, resolutions, and the normal human rituals that mark the passage of time. For most of the world, it was simply the end of another year. For millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, It was the collapse of their deepest hopes and the beginning of a crisis of faith that would reshape their movement forever. The end didn't come. Armageddon didn't arrive. The current world system continued exactly as it had before. Franz's calculations, presented with such scholarly authority and accepted with such complete faith, proved to be spectacularly wrong. The failure of the 1975 prediction created human wreckage on an unprecedented scale. Families who had sold homes found themselves in financial crisis. Young people who had postponed education discovered that they were years behind their peers in academic and professional development. Older believers who had cashed in retirement funds faced poverty in their final years. The emotional consequences were equally devastating. Many believers experienced what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the painful mental conflict that occurs when deeply held beliefs are contradicted by undeniable evidence. Some resolved this conflict by leaving the organization entirely. Others resolved it by suppressing their doubts and maintaining faith despite the evidence. Frederick Franz's response to the failure of his prediction revealed the psychological mechanisms that had made the prediction possible in the first place. Rather than acknowledging error, Franz began a systematic campaign to deflect responsibility and maintain his authority within the organization. Franz's primary strategy was to blame the believers themselves for misunderstanding the organization's teachings. He suggested that overeager Jehovah's Witnesses had read more into the chronological system than was actually claimed. He portrayed the 1975 prediction as a possibility that some believers had mistakenly treated as a certainty. This deflection was psychologically necessary for Franz to maintain his position within the organization. Acknowledging that his chronological system was fundamentally flawed would have undermined not just the 1975 prediction, but his entire authority as biblical interpreter. Franz chose to preserve his authority at the cost of taking responsibility for the consequences of his interpretation. The aftermath of 1975 revealed one of the most striking paradoxes in modern religious history. Frederick Franz wielded prophetic authority while adamantly denying that he was a prophet. This wasn't merely semantic evasion, it was a sophisticated system for exercising prophetic power while avoiding prophetic accountability. Franz's denial of prophetic status was technically accurate according to his own definitions. He never claimed direct divine revelation through visions, dreams, or audible voices from God. He never presented himself as an inspired prophet in the biblical sense. Instead, Franz claimed to be a biblical scholar whose interpretations were guided by God's Spirit but remained fallible human reasoning. However, this technical distinction masked the practical reality of Franz's role within the organization. While Franz denied being a prophet, his interpretations carried absolute authority for millions of believers. His biblical explanations weren't treated as scholarly opinions open to debate, they were received as divine truth that required unquestioning acceptance. Franz's system for exercising prophetic authority without prophetic accountability was ingenious in its sophistication. Rather than claiming direct inspiration, Franz claimed to possess superior biblical knowledge and interpretive ability. Rather than declaring divine revelation, he declared logical conclusions from careful study. Rather than demanding faith in his prophetic authority, he demanded faith in his scholarly expertise. This approach provided multiple layers of protection from accusations of false prophecy. When Franz's interpretations proved wrong, he could claim that he was merely expressing scholarly opinions rather than divine revelations. When critics challenged his authority, he could point to his extensive biblical knowledge rather than claims of inspiration. Franz's mastery of religious language allowed him to express absolute certainty while maintaining technical deniability. His writings and speeches were filled with phrases that conveyed prophetic confidence while preserving scholarly escape routes. He would present interpretations as clearly indicated by Scripture, strongly suggested by biblical evidence, or logically required by careful study. Franz's denial of prophetic status was supported by an elaborate institutional framework that protected him from accountability while preserving his authority. The Watchtower organization developed doctrines that explained how God could guide human reasoning without directly inspiring it, how biblical interpretation could be authoritative without being infallible, and how organizational teachings could be true without being revelatory. The most troubling aspect of Franz's system was the double standard it created between authority and responsibility. Franz claimed absolute authority to interpret biblical truth for millions of believers, but he accepted no responsibility for the consequences of his interpretations. When his interpretations proved wrong, the fault lay with believers who misunderstood or read too much into his scholarly conclusions. Understanding Franz's denial of prophetic status requires examining the psychological mechanisms that allowed him to maintain absolute confidence in his interpretations while avoiding accountability for their consequences. Franz appears to have genuinely believed that his biblical knowledge and interpretive abilities were superior to those of ordinary believers and even other religious scholars. Franz's system created an impossible dilemma for ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses. They were required to have absolute faith in interpretations that were presented as fallible scholarly conclusions. They were expected to reorganize their lives around biblical explanations that might be wrong. They were encouraged to base their eternal hopes on chronological calculations that carried no guarantee of accuracy. The psychological pressure this dilemma created helps explain both the intensity of belief among Jehovah's Witnesses during the 1970s and the devastating impact of the 1975 failure. Believers invested tremendous emotional energy in maintaining faith in interpretations they were told might be wrong. When those interpretations failed, the psychological collapse was proportionally severe. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Frederick Franz's story is not his spectacular prophetic failure in 1975, but his remarkable survival as the organization's supreme authority for another 17 years. In 1977, following Nathan Knorr's death, Franz became president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He would hold this position until his death in 1992, at the age of 99. Franz's ascension to the presidency after the 1975 debacle represents one of the most remarkable demonstrations of institutional power protection in modern religious history. Any reasonable assessment would suggest that the architect of such a devastating prophetic failure should have been removed from leadership, or at least marginalized within the organization. Instead, Franz was promoted to the highest position of authority and continued to exercise absolute control over the beliefs of millions of believers. The Watchtower organization's protection of Franz after 1975 involved several sophisticated strategies that preserved his authority while minimizing the damage to organizational credibility. The first mechanism was historical revisionism. Publications after 1975 gradually rewrote the history of the 1975 prediction, minimizing Franz's role and shifting responsibility to overeager believers. The second mechanism was doctrinal development. The organization refined its teachings about prophetic interpretation, creating more sophisticated explanations for how biblical chronology should be understood. The third mechanism was leadership restructuring. While Franz became president, the organization also developed a more collective leadership model through the expanded governing body. The expansion of the governing body during the 1970s represented a significant change in how the Watchtower organization exercised authority. However, this system didn't diminish Franz's actual power. It simply provided better protection for that power. Franz remained the primary theological voice within the governing body, and his interpretive authority continued to shape all major doctrinal decisions. One of the most remarkable aspects of Franz's survival was the organization's gradual rehabilitation of his reputation. Rather than treating the 1975 failure as a permanent stain on Franz's credibility, the organization gradually reconstructed the narrative to portray Franz as a wise leader who had learned from experience. During his presidency, Franz continued to exercise enormous influence over Watchtower doctrine, but he adapted his methods to avoid the specific date setting that had caused the 1975 debacle. Instead of making precise chronological predictions, Franz focused on developing complex theological systems that maintained urgency about the end without specifying exact timing. Franz's personal psychology during his presidency reveals fascinating insights into how individuals can maintain authority and self-confidence even after spectacular public failures. Rather than being crushed by the 1975 debacle, Franz seemed to emerge with his confidence intact and his authority enhanced. Franz's survival and continued influence had profound implications for the development of the Watchtower organization. On one hand, the 1975 experience taught the organization valuable lessons about the dangers of specific date setting and the importance of maintaining flexibility in prophetic interpretation. However, the organization failed to learn the most important lesson from the 1975 experience: the danger of concentrating interpretive authority in a single individual without meaningful accountability mechanisms. During his presidency, Franz's influence extended to every country where Jehovah's Witnesses were established. His theological interpretations, filtered through the organization's publications and convention programs, continued to shape the beliefs and expectations of millions of people worldwide. Franz remained president of the Watchtower organization until his death on December 22, 1992. Even in his final years, when age might have diminished his influence, Franz continued to exercise significant authority over organizational doctrine and policy. The fact that Franz died in office, at the age of 99, while still serving as president of the organization, represents the ultimate demonstration of his remarkable ability to maintain authority despite spectacular failure. Following Franz's death, the Watchtower organization has continued to protect his legacy while learning from his mistakes. Franz is remembered within the organization as a faithful servant and gifted biblical scholar, while the 1975 prediction is treated as a minor episode in organizational history rather than a defining failure. Frederick William Franz died in 1992 as a respected president of one of the world's largest religious organizations, surrounded by subordinates who treated his every word as inspired wisdom. He was 99 years old, had served as the organization's primary theological authority for over 5 decades, and had shaped the beliefs of millions of people across 6 continents. By any conventional measure, Franz was one of the most successful religious leaders of the 20th century. But Franz's success came at a devastating human cost that reveals disturbing truths about how religious authority operates in the modern world. The man who convinced millions of people that the world would end in 1975 not only survived the spectacular failure of his prediction, he was promoted, protected, and allowed to exercise even greater authority until his natural death 17 years later. This investigation has revealed that Franz wasn't simply a failed prophet who got lucky. He was something far more sophisticated and dangerous. A brilliant manipulator who constructed a system of religious authority that could survive even the most obvious evidence of its own fallibility. Franz didn't just predict the end of the world. He constructed a reality where his authority to predict the end of the world was more important than the accuracy of his predictions. Franz's career provides a disturbing case study in how intelligent, sincere people can be convinced to restructure their entire lives around the interpretations of a single individual. The believers who sold their homes, abandoned their educations, and cashed in their retirement funds based on Franz's 1975 prediction weren't ignorant or gullible. They were rational people responding logically to authority figures they had been taught to trust absolutely. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation of this investigation is how effectively modern religious institutions can protect failed leadership from the consequences of their failures. Franz's survival after 1975 demonstrates that religious organizations possess sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining leadership authority even when that authority has been demonstrably discredited. Franz's ability to maintain absolute confidence in his interpretive abilities despite the obvious failure of his most specific prediction reveals important insights into the psychology of religious authority. Franz appears to have genuinely believed in his own authority even after his authority had been thoroughly discredited. The believers who followed Franz face a dilemma that extends far beyond the specific context of Jehovah's Witnesses. In an age where religious authority increasingly claims scholarly rather than revelatory foundations, how can sincere believers distinguish between legitimate biblical scholarship and sophisticated religious manipulation? The human cost of Franz's theological influence extends far beyond the immediate consequences of the 1975 prediction. For over 5 decades, Franz's interpretations shaped the life choices of millions of people across the globe. His teachings about education, career planning, family decisions, and personal priorities influenced multiple generations of believers who organized their lives around his understanding of biblical truth. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Franz's legacy is how effectively it has been preserved and protected by the institutional mechanisms he helped create. More than 3 decades after his death, Franz's interpretive authority continues to influence millions of believers through the theological systems he constructed and the institutional frameworks he helped establish. This investigation began with a fundamental question. Was Frederick Franz a prophet, a visionary, or simply a man obsessed with biblical numbers? The evidence suggests a more complex and disturbing answer. Franz was a brilliant individual who constructed a sophisticated system for exercising prophetic authority without accepting prophetic responsibility. Frederick Franz died as he lived, wielding absolute authority over the interpretation of divine truth for millions of believers worldwide. He never acknowledged error in his 1975 prediction, never accepted responsibility for the human consequences of his interpretations, and never submitted his theological authority to external verification or accountability. In the end, Franz succeeded in something far more extraordinary than accurate prophecy. He constructed a reality where his authority to make prophetic interpretations was more important than the accuracy of those interpretations. He convinced millions of people that his scholarly expertise was sufficient grounds for restructuring their entire understanding of reality. The story of Frederick Franz serves as a warning about the dangers of religious authority that claims absolute interpretive power while accepting no meaningful accountability. The question that remains for contemporary believers is whether they will learn from Franz's example or repeat it. Will future generations develop better mechanisms for holding religious authority accountable, or will they continue to accept sophisticated claims of interpretive expertise without adequate verification? Frederick Franz spent 79 years convincing millions of people that he possessed special insight into divine truth. He died without ever proving that his insight was accurate, but also without ever facing meaningful consequences for the damage caused by his interpretations. His legacy stands as both a testament to the power of religious authority and a warning about the human cost of accepting that authority without adequate accountability. The prophet who rewrote reality left behind a world where millions of people continue to organize their lives around interpretations that cannot be verified and leaders who cannot be held accountable. Whether that world will learn from Franz's example or repeat his mistakes remains one of the most important questions facing modern religious believers.